The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as 12-year-old Lily clutched her lunchbox, walking down the bustling streets of downtown after her weekly piano lessons. Her grandmother had packed her favorite peanut butter and honey sandwich, along with fresh apple slices and homemade chocolate chip cookies, a treat she looked forward to every Wednesday afternoon. As she approached her usual spot in the small park where she waited for her mother to pick her up, something caught her eye. Huddled on a worn wooden bench was an elderly man, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a tattered navy blue cap. His clothes, though clean, showed signs of wear, and beside him sat a small cart containing what appeared to be all his worldly possessions. Lily had seen homeless people before, but something about this man's gentle demeanor touched her heart. Despite her grandmother's warnings about talking to strangers, she couldn't help but notice how he politely nodded to passers-by, though most hurried past without a second glance. His eyes held a kindness that reminded her of her late grandfather. The aroma of her lunch wafted from her lunchbox, and she noticed how the man's gaze briefly flickered toward it before returning to watch the pigeons pecking at scattered breadcrumbs. Lily's stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, but a voice inside her head, one that sounded remarkably like her mother's, whispered about the importance of helping others. With careful steps, she approached the bench. "Excuse me, sir." Her voice came out smaller than intended. The man looked up, surprised at being addressed. "Would you like to share my lunch? My grandmother always packs too much anyway." This wasn't entirely true. Her grandmother packed exactly the right amount, but Lily felt this small white lie was justified. The man's eyes welled with tears, catching Lily off guard. "Young lady," he said, his voice rough but gentle, "that's the kindest offer I've received in months." He introduced himself as Mr. Chen, a former librarian who had fallen on hard times after a series of unfortunate events, the loss of his job, mounting medical bills, and finally, the loss of his home. As they shared the sandwich and cookies, Mr. Chen told Lily stories about his days in the library, how he used to organize special reading sessions for children, and how he once helped a young immigrant learn English through books. His face lit up when speaking about literature, and Lily found herself hanging on every word. They were so engrossed in conversation that Lily almost missed her mother's car pulling up to the curb. As she hurriedly packed up her lunchbox, Mr. Chen thanked her again, his voice thick with emotion. "You remind me of my granddaughter," he said softly. "I haven't seen her in years." That evening, as Lily recounted the story to her mother and grandmother over dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was more than just a simple act of sharing lunch. Her mother listened intently, a thoughtful expression on her face, while her grandmother wiped away tears, muttering something about raising her right. Little did Lily know that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change Mr. Chen's life but would also transform their entire community's perspective on homelessness and human connection. As she lay in bed that night, thinking about Mr. Chen's stories and his kind eyes, she had no idea that tomorrow would bring an unexpected turn of events that would leave everyone astounded. The next morning arrived with an unexpected autumn shower, sending sheets of rain cascading down the city streets. Lily sat at the breakfast table, pushing her cereal around the bowl, her thoughts still with Mr. Chen. She wondered if he had found somewhere dry to shelter from the downpour. "Mom," she spoke up suddenly, "do you think we could bring Mr. Chen some hot soup today? It's so cold outside." Her mother looked up from her phone, where she'd been reading something with intense concentration. The expression on her face was difficult to read. "Actually, sweetheart, there's something I need to tell you," her mother said, placing her phone down. "After you went to bed last night, I did some research about Mr. Chen. You mentioned he used to be a librarian, so I looked him up on social media and made a few calls." Lily's heart skipped a beat. Had she done something wrong by sharing her lunch with him? "It turns out," her mother continued, her voice softening, "that Mr. Chen was quite well known in the library community. He worked at the Central Library for over 30 years and started their first English as a second language program. He helped hundreds of immigrants learn English and find jobs. People still talk about his dedication. Lily leaned forward, eager to hear more about the gentle man she'd met. But 3 years ago, his wife got very sick. The medical bills piled up, and then the pandemic hit. The library had to cut staff, and even though Mr. Chen had seniority, he volunteered to retire so younger employees with families could keep their jobs. He sold his house to pay for his wife's treatment, but... Her mother paused, choosing her words carefully. She didn't make it. After that, he just disappeared. His daughter and granddaughter have been looking for him ever since. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. That's why he mentioned his granddaughter, she whispered. Yes, and here's the amazing part, her mother continued, turning her phone to show Lily a social media post. Someone took a photo of you two sharing lunch yesterday. It's gone viral overnight. His daughter saw it. The photo showed Lily and Mr. Chen sitting on the bench, sharing cookies and laughing at one of his stories. The autumn sunlight had caught them at just the right angle, creating a warm, almost magical atmosphere. The post had thousands of shares and comments. His daughter is flying in today, her mother explained. She's been searching for him for almost 2 years. Your small act of kindness didn't just provide him with a meal, Lily, it's helping reunite a family. But that wasn't all. The post had caught the attention of the local community. Comments poured in from former students of his English classes, sharing stories of how Mr. Chen had changed their lives. A local reporter had picked up the story, and the neighborhood coffee shop owner recognized him as the polite man who sometimes came in just to get warm. Can we go see him? Lily asked, barely touching her breakfast. We need to tell him about his daughter. Her mother nodded, already reaching for her car keys. I packed some breakfast and warm clothes for him. The coffee shop owner said he usually sleeps in the park. The rain had settled into a gentle drizzle as they drove downtown. Lily clutched a thermos of hot chocolate, her heart pounding with excitement. But when they reached the park, Mr. Chen wasn't on his usual bench. They searched the nearby streets, checking every doorway and sheltered spot. Finally, they found him huddled under the awning of a closed bookstore, his cart protected from the rain, reading a discarded newspaper. His face lit up when he saw Lily, but confusion crossed his features at the sight of her mother. Mr. Chen, Lily called out, running toward him despite the rain. We've been looking for you. Something amazing has happened. Her mother approached more slowly, holding an umbrella and a bag of warm clothes. Mr. Chen, she said gently, I'm Lily's mother. We need to tell you something important. Your daughter May has been looking for you. The newspaper slipped from his trembling hands. May, he whispered, his voice catching. You've spoken to May? She saw a photo of you and Lily from yesterday. She's on her way here right now. She never stopped looking for you, Mr. Chen. Never. The proud man who had shared stories and cookies with Lily just yesterday seemed to crumble. Tears mixed with raindrops on his cheeks as he covered his face with his weathered hands. I thought they would be better off without me. After everything that happened, after I lost everything. They never wanted your money or your house, Mr. Chen, Lily's mother said softly. They just wanted you. Family is about more than what you can provide, it's about love. As if on cue, the bells of the nearby church began to chime, and the rain started to ease. Lily took Mr. Chen's hand, noting how cold it felt. Come with us, she said. We can wait for May at our house. Mom made breakfast, and Grandma wants to meet you too. The old librarian looked at this unexpected angel who had shared her lunch and now was helping to piece his life back together. Why? He asked. Why are you helping me? Lily squeezed his hand. Because everyone deserves kindness. And because your stories yesterday reminded me that we're all just people who sometimes need a friend. As they helped Mr. Chen gather his few belongings and walk toward their car, the sun began to break through the clouds. Neither Lily nor Mr. Chen knew it yet, but this was just the beginning of an extraordinary day that would remind their entire community about the power of simple acts of kindness and the unbreakable bonds of family, both the ones we're born into and the ones we create through compassion. The drive to Lily's house was quiet, filled with unspoken emotions. Mr. Chen sat in the back seat, his worn cart safely stored in the trunk, holding the thermos of hot chocolate that had long since stopped steaming. Every few minutes, Lily would turn around from the front seat to give him a reassuring smile, though she could see his hands trembling slightly. When they pulled into the driveway, Lily's grandmother was already waiting at the door, wearing her favorite apron and a warm smile that could melt winter frost. The aroma of fresh dumplings wafted through the air. She had been stress cooking all morning since hearing Mr. Chen's story. "Please, come in," she said, bowing slightly in traditional greeting. Mr. Chen's eyes widened in recognition of the gesture, and he returned it with practiced grace despite his weathered appearance. "I made some traditional dumplings. I hope they're close to the ones from home." Inside, the house was warm and inviting. Lily's grandmother had transformed their living room into a comfortable space with extra blankets and pillows. On the coffee table, she had laid out not just dumplings but also hot tea and various breakfast items. First, Lily's mother said gently, "We have some clean clothes for you, and you can use our bathroom to freshen up. Take all the time you need. May's flight doesn't land for another 2 hours." Mr. Chen stood in the middle of their living room, overwhelmed by the kindness surrounding him. I don't deserve all this," he whispered, his voice cracking. Lily's grandmother stepped forward, her face stern but kind. "Deserve? Who are we to judge what anyone deserves? Life is not about deserving, it's about caring for each other. Now, go clean up while the dumplings are still hot." While Mr. Chen was in the bathroom, Lily's phone buzzed continuously with notifications. The story had grown even bigger. Local news stations were calling, requesting interviews. The library where Mr. Chen had worked released a statement about his years of service and the lives he had touched. Former students were organizing a welcome committee at the airport for May's arrival. But more importantly, people were starting to have conversations about homelessness in their community. The viral photo had put a human face on an issue many found easy to ignore. Comments flooded social media with similar stories of former professionals who had fallen on hard times, and discussions began about how communities could better support their vulnerable members. When Mr. Chen emerged from the bathroom, he looked transformed. Clean-shaven, wearing fresh clothes, his silver hair neatly combed, he carried himself with a hint of his former dignity. But his eyes still held uncertainty and shame. "Would you like to see what people are saying about you?" Lily asked, holding up her tablet. Mr. Chen hesitated but nodded, sitting down beside her on the couch. Together, they read through the comments. Former students shared memories of his patience and kindness. "Mr. Chen helped my parents learn English when we first came to America," one wrote. "He stayed after hours, never asked for payment, and even helped my father prepare for job interviews. I'm now a teacher because of his influence." Another comment read, "I was struggling with cultural adjustment and almost dropped out of school. Mr. Chen noticed and started a cultural exchange club at the library. He showed me that being different was a strength, not a weakness. I can't believe he's been suffering alone all this time." Tears rolled down Mr. Chen's cheeks as he read message after message. "I thought everyone had forgotten," he murmured. "After everything that happened, after I lost my Ming and then my home. I felt such shame. How could I face anyone? How could I tell May that her father was sleeping on park benches?" Lily's grandmother placed a fresh cup of tea in his hands. "Shame is a heavy burden to carry alone," she said wisely. "But look at all these people who remember you with love. Your worth was never in your possessions or your job, it was in how you touched people's lives." As the morning progressed, more people began arriving at the house. The coffee shop owner who had recognized Mr. Chen brought fresh pastries and coffee for everyone. A former colleague from the library arrived with books she had saved from his old office, including his favorite collection of poetry. Each visitor brought not just gifts, but stories and memories that helped piece together the dignity Mr. Chen had thought he'd lost forever. The local news crew set up outside, respectfully waiting to document the reunion. But inside the house, time seemed to stand still. Mr. Chen shared stories about his late wife Ming, how they had met at university in China, their journey to America, and their dreams for their daughter May. He spoke of the devastating illness that had taken Ming, and how lost he had felt trying to navigate life without his partner of 40 years. Ming always said that a library was like a garden of knowledge, he recalled, a soft smile playing on his lips. She would say, "You plant seeds of learning, and you never know which ones will grow into mighty trees. I never expected that those seeds would bloom again like this." As the time for May's arrival drew closer, nervous energy filled the house. Mr. Chen kept straightening his borrowed clothes, running his hands through his hair. Lily sat next to him, holding his hand just as she had done in the park. "What if she's angry?" he whispered to Lily. "What if she can't forgive me for disappearing?" "She spent 2 years looking for you," Lily reminded him. "That's not anger, that's love." Just then, a car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, they could see a woman in her 30s hurriedly getting out, almost forgetting to close the car door. She had her father's gentle eyes and carried herself with the same grace that Mr. Chen had displayed earlier. The entire house held its breath. Mr. Chen stood up, supported by Lily's steady presence beside him. The doorbell rang, and time seemed to freeze for a moment that felt like eternity. This was the moment when a father's shame would meet a daughter's love, when past mistakes would collide with future possibilities, and when a simple act of sharing lunch would complete its transformation into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. When Lily's mother opened the door, time seemed to stand still. May stood there, her hand still raised as if to knock again, tears already streaming down her face. Behind her, a little girl about 7 years old clutched her mother's coat, eyes wide with anticipation. "Baba?" May's voice trembled as she caught sight of her father standing in the living room. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, with a sob that seemed to release 2 years of worry and searching, she rushed forward. "Baba!" Mr. Chen caught his daughter in his arms, and they clung to each other as if afraid the other might disappear. Their words tumbled out in a mix of English and Chinese, 2 years of unspoken thoughts trying to escape all at once. "I'm sorry," and "I missed you," and "I love you," blended together in a stream of tears and emotion. The little girl, Mr. Chen's granddaughter Lin, stood uncertainly by the door until Lily walked over and held out her hand. "Hi, I'm Lily. Would you like to see the cookies my grandmother made?" Lin looked at Lily's offered hand, then at her mother and grandfather still embracing, before slowly taking it. As the adults wiped away tears, Lin's presence seemed to break the heavy emotional tension. Mr. Chen knelt down to her level, his hands shaking. "Lin," he said softly, "do you remember your Ye?" Lin studied him carefully before saying, "Mama shows me your pictures every day. She says you're the best storyteller in the world." Then, with the simple acceptance that only children possess, she added, "Will you tell me a story now?" Fresh tears sprang to Mr. Chen's eyes as he gathered his granddaughter into his arms. "I have so many stories to tell you, little one. So many stories." The reunion drew more attention than anyone had expected. News vans lined the quiet suburban street, but Lily's mother firmly kept them outside, protecting the family's private moments. Instead, the story spread through social media, where it took on a life of its own. The coffee shop owner had started a fundraiser to help Mr. Chen get back on his feet, but it had grown far beyond its original goal. People from all over the country were donating, many adding their own stories about times when a small act of kindness had changed their lives. Inside the house, May finally had a chance to share her side of the story. "After Mom died, you just disappeared," she said, holding her father's hand. "I came to the house, but you were gone. All the neighbors said you'd sold everything and left. I hired private investigators, contacted every library in the state, posted on every social media platform I could find. I thought I had failed you," Mr. Chen replied quietly. "Failed your mother? I couldn't save her, couldn't keep our home. What kind of father loses everything?" "The kind who gives up everything to save his wife," May said firmly. "The kind who thinks of others before himself. The kind who teaches hundreds of people to read and speak English without ever asking for recognition. That's the kind of father you are, Baba." Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Lin was helping Lily and her grandmother make more dumplings, giggling as she tried to fold the wrappers just right. The two girls had formed an instant connection, sharing stories about school and their favorite books. The local library director arrived with an unexpected proposal. "Mr. Chen," she said, "we've been following your story, and we've created a new position we'd like to offer you. We want to start a community outreach program, helping homeless and struggling community members access educational resources. Who better to run it than someone who understands both the library world and the challenges these people face?" The offer was more than just a job, it was a chance to turn his painful experiences into something meaningful, to help others who were facing similar struggles. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived. Former students brought their children, eager to introduce them to the man who had helped their families build new lives in America. The coffee shop owner announced that his fundraiser had exceeded all expectations, with enough money to help Mr. Chen secure an apartment and start over. But perhaps the most touching moment came when Lin climbed onto her grandfather's lap with a book she'd found on Lily's shelf. "Yay, will you read to me?" she asked. "Like in the stories Mama tells?" Mr. Chen opened the book, his voice growing stronger with each word. Around him, conversations quieted as everyone listened to the former librarian doing what he loved best, sharing the magic of stories with a child. Lily watched from her spot on the floor, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. Her simple decision to share her lunch had sparked something remarkable. Not just a family reunion, but a reminder to an entire community about the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their circumstances. The local news finally got their story, but it wasn't just about a homeless man reuniting with his family. It became a story about community, about the ripple effects of kindness, and about how one small gesture could start a wave of positive change. That evening, as the excitement began to wind down, Mr. Chen found a quiet moment with Lily. "You know," he said, "in all my years of teaching others about the power of stories, I never expected to be part of one like this. You didn't just share your lunch with me yesterday, you gave me back my life, my family, my dignity." Lily smiled, thinking about how different everything was from just 24 hours ago. "I just did what felt right," she said simply. "Sometimes," Mr. Chen replied, watching Lin play with her mother across the room, "the simplest actions have the most profound effects. Like dropping a pebble in a pond, you never know how far the ripples will reach." As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the windows, nobody wanted the day to end. But this wasn't really an ending at all, it was a beginning. A beginning of new stories, new opportunities, and new understanding in a community that had been reminded of the extraordinary power of ordinary kindness. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The story of Lily and Mr. Chen had touched something deep in people's hearts, spreading far beyond their local community. News outlets from across the country picked up the story, not just focusing on the heartwarming reunion, but using it to spark important conversations about homelessness, mental health, and the importance of community support. Mr. Chen moved into a small but comfortable apartment just 3 blocks from the library, thanks to the fundraiser that had now grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The coffee shop owner's initiative had raised enough money to not only help Mr. Chen but to start a community foundation aimed at helping others in similar situations. Mei and Lin extended their stay, helping Mr. Chen settle into his new home. The apartment quickly filled with books, donations from community members who remembered the librarian's love for literature. Each volume came with notes and messages, memories of how Mr. Chen had touched their lives through his work at the library. One morning, as Lily walked to school, she noticed something different about her community. The park where she had first shared her lunch with Mr. Chen had a new sign, "Everyone has a story, Community Support Center coming soon." The viral photo of their lunch-sharing moment had been enlarged and placed on the announcement board, becoming a symbol of hope and change. At school, Lily found herself the center of attention, but not in the way she expected. Her classmates weren't just curious about the viral story, they wanted to know how they could help. The student council approached her about starting a lunch buddy program, where students could learn about food insecurity and find ways to help those in need. "You showed us that we're never too young to make a difference," her class president said during morning assembly. "Sometimes we think we need to do something big to change the world, but you proved that even sharing a sandwich can start something amazing." After school, Lily visited Mr. Chen at his new apartment. Lin was there, doing homework at the kitchen table while Mr. Chen prepared for his first day back at the library. The walls were decorated with framed newspaper clippings about their story, alongside family photos May had brought, memories of happier times now merging with new beginnings. "Look what arrived today," Mr. Chen said excitedly, showing Lily a stack of letters. They were from libraries across the country, asking for advice on starting similar community outreach programs. They want to know how to better serve homeless patrons and create safe spaces for everyone. Your simple act of kindness is creating change everywhere. As they sat together over cups of hot chocolate, which had become their tradition, Mr. Chen shared his plans for the library's new community outreach program. "We're going to offer more than just books," he explained. "We'll have job search assistance, computer literacy classes, and a safe space for people to spend their days. And most importantly, we'll have volunteers trained to listen without judgment, to see the person behind the circumstances." Lily noticed how his eyes sparkled when he talked about helping others, the same way they had when he first told her stories in the park. The shame and sadness that had weighed him down was replaced by purpose and hope. Later that evening, the local community center hosted a meeting to discuss the new initiatives sparked by their story. The room was packed with people eager to help. The coffee shop owner presented plans for a suspended coffee program, where customers could prepay for drinks and meals for those who couldn't afford them. A local hotel owner offered to convert an unused floor into temporary housing for people in transition. But perhaps the most touching moment came when a group of former homeless individuals stood up to share their stories. Inspired by Mr. Chen's experience, they spoke about their own journeys, helping others understand that homelessness could happen to anyone. 2 years ago, I was a software engineer, one woman shared. Then I got sick, lost my job, and eventually my home. What hurt more than losing everything was becoming invisible to people who used to smile and chat with me every day. That's why this story matters, it reminds us to see each other's humanity. The meeting turned into a workshop, with people breaking into groups to discuss different ways to help. Lily sat with a group of students her age, brainstorming ideas for school involvement. Lynn joined them, adding her perspective as someone who had almost lost her grandfather to circumstances beyond his control. "Maybe we could start a storytelling club," Lynn suggested shyly. "Like what Ye used to do at the library. People could share their stories, and we could learn from each other." The idea caught on immediately. The local bookstore offered to host weekly storytelling sessions, bringing together people from all walks of life to share their experiences. Mr. Chen would lead the first session, using his gift for storytelling to build bridges of understanding in the community. As Lily walked home that evening with her mother, they passed the park bench where it all began. Someone had placed fresh flowers there, with a small sign that read, "Kindness begins here." "You know," her mother said, "when you first told me about sharing your lunch with Mr. Chen, I was worried. We always teach children to be careful around strangers. But you saw something I didn't, you saw a person who needed help, not just a stranger on a bench." Lily thought about how much had changed in just a few days. "I just shared my lunch," she said. "I never expected all of this." "That's the thing about kindness," her mother replied. "It's like planting a seed. You might think you're just putting something small into the world, but with the right conditions, with people who care enough to nurture it, it can grow into something beautiful and strong." As they turned onto their street, they could see Mr. Chen and Lin in his apartment window, probably practicing for tomorrow's storytelling session. The light from his window cast a warm glow onto the sidewalk, a beacon of hope that reminded everyone who passed by that second chances were possible, that community mattered, and that sometimes the smallest actions could create the biggest changes. The morning of Mr. Chen's first storytelling session arrived with golden autumn sunshine streaming through the library's tall windows. The community room, usually used for children's reading time, had been transformed. Chairs were arranged in a welcoming circle, and the walls were decorated with photographs from community members sharing their own stories of struggle and triumph. Lily arrived early with her mother and grandmother, carrying homemade cookies, the same kind she had shared with Mr. Chen that first day. The room was already filling up, with people from all walks of life taking their seats. Lin was helping her grandfather arrange his storytelling chair, placing a warm cup of tea on the small table beside it. "I'm nervous," Mr. Chen confided to Lily as she helped arrange the cookies on a welcome table. "What if I can't connect with them the way I used to?" "Just tell your story like you told it to me," Lily responded, straightening his collar with the familiarity of an old friend. "Remember, everyone here wants to listen and learn." The session began with more people than the room could hold. Some sat on cushions on the floor, while others stood along the walls. The library director had to open the folding doors to accommodate the overflow crowd. Among the audience were local government officials, social workers, and most importantly, several people currently experiencing homelessness who had been personally invited by Mr. Chen. "Welcome," Mr. Chen began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "In Chinese tradition, we have a saying, to tell a story is to share a piece of your soul. Today, I want to share my soul with you, and I hope you'll share yours with me." He started with his own story, not just the recent parts that everyone knew from the news, but from the beginning. He spoke of growing up in China during difficult times, of his parents' sacrifice to educate him, of falling in love with Ming and their dream of building a life in America. He talked about the challenges of being immigrants, of learning a new language and culture, and of finding their place in a new world. "Books were my bridge," he explained, holding up a worn copy of his first English dictionary. "They connected me to this new world, helped me understand its heart. That's why I became a librarian, to help build bridges for others." As he spoke about losing Ming, his voice cracked with emotion, but he continued. "Grief can be like quicksand," he said. "The more you struggle alone, the deeper you sink. I thought I was protecting my family by disappearing, but I was wrong. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept help." Then he turned to Lily, who sat with Lin in the front row. "And sometimes, help comes in the most unexpected ways. A 12-year-old girl with a sandwich showed me that dignity isn't about what you own or where you sleep. It's about human connection." The room was silent, every person hanging on his words. Then Mr. Chen did something unexpected. He stood up and walked to the center of the circle. "Now," he said, "who would like to share their story?" One by one, people began to speak. A young mother talked about fleeing domestic violence and living in her car with her children. A former executive shared how medical bills from his child's illness had cost him everything. A veteran spoke about struggling with PTSD and homelessness until a fellow veteran helped him find support. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads of humanity, struggle, and hope. As people spoke, others nodded in understanding or quietly wiped away tears. The barriers between us and them began to dissolve. During a brief break, the coffee shop owner announced that his business would start a job training program for people trying to get back on their feet. The local community college representative offered to provide free classes to anyone referred through the library's new outreach program. A real estate agent stood up to pledge several apartments at reduced rent for families in transition. But it was a quiet announcement from one of the homeless attendees that brought the room to tears. "I've been living on the streets for 3 years," he said. "Today is the first time anyone has asked to hear my story. Just being heard, being seen as a person, that means more than any donation." The session extended well past its scheduled time, but nobody wanted to leave. People exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet again. The library director had to promise to make it a weekly event to satisfy everyone's desire to continue these conversations. After most people had left, Lily found Mr. Chen sitting quietly in his storytelling chair, looking thoughtful. "You did it," she said, sitting beside him. "You turned your pain into purpose." "No, little one," he replied, patting her hand. "We did it together. Your kindness showed me that every story matters, even when we think we've reached the last page." That evening, as the library staff cleaned up, they found something remarkable. On a blank wall, someone had started a story wall. Post-it notes covered the surface, each containing a message of hope, a pledge to help, or a piece of someone's story. The library director decided to leave it up, providing more notes and pens for others to add their voices. The local news covered the event, but this time, they focused on the bigger picture. It wasn't just about one man's journey from homelessness to hope, it was about a community learning to see and hear each other in new ways. As Lily and Lin helped Mr. Chen carry his materials home, they passed the park bench where everything had started. Someone had tied a ribbon around it with a quote, "Every story deserves to be heard, every person deserves to be seen." "Yay," Lin asked, using the Chinese word for grandfather, "do you think we can really change things? Make it better for everyone who needs help?" Mr. Chen looked at the two girls, his granddaughter and the young friend who had changed his life with a simple act of kindness. "Change doesn't always come in grand gestures," he said. "Sometimes it comes in small moments of connection, in shared stories, in offered hands, in shared lunches. And yes, I believe we can make things better, one story at a time." 1 month after the first storytelling session, the changes in the community were impossible to miss. The library had become a bustling center of activity, with Mr. Chen's community outreach program growing beyond anyone's expectations. The story wall had expanded to cover 3 walls, with hundreds of colorful notes sharing messages of hope, support, and transformation. On this particular morning, Lily sat with Lin in their new favorite spot, a cozy corner of the library they had helped design specifically for the outreach program. They were sorting through letters that had arrived from other cities, all asking about how to start similar programs in their communities. "Listen to this one," Lin said, holding up a letter. "It's from a library in Seattle. They want Ye to do a video call to help them set up their own storytelling sessions. They say our story inspired them to rethink how they serve their community." The girls had become inseparable over the past month, bonding over their shared experience of helping others. Together, they had started a youth volunteer program at the library, encouraging their classmates to get involved in community service. Mr. Chen appeared from between the bookshelves, carrying a stack of new books for the outreach program. His entire demeanor had changed from the man Lily first met on the park bench. He stood taller now, his eyes bright with purpose, his smile ready and warm for everyone he met. "Girls," he called out, "come see what just arrived." He led them to the library's entrance, where a brand new sign was being installed, "The Bridge Community Center, where every story matters." The library had officially expanded its mission, dedicating its entire ground floor to community support services. And that's not all, he said, pulling out a newspaper. Remember Mrs. Rivera from the first storytelling session? The one who lost her home after medical bills? The girls nodded eagerly. Well, look at this. The article showed Mrs. Rivera standing proudly in front of a small food truck. The coffee shop owner had helped her secure a loan to start her own business, combining her love of cooking with her desire to give back to the community. Her food truck would operate on a pay-what-you-can model, ensuring that nobody went hungry regardless of their ability to pay. But wait until you hear the best part, Mr. Chen continued, leading them to the community room. Inside, several people were setting up computers and desks. Thanks to all the attention our story has received, we've received a grant to create a full-service resource center. We'll have job counselors, social workers, and healthcare providers here 3 days a week. Lily noticed a familiar face among the volunteers, the former executive who had shared his story at the first session. He had found a new job and was now dedicating his free time to helping others navigate financial hardships and rebuild their lives. Sometimes, he told Lily as he set up his desk, you have to lose everything to find your true purpose. Your kindness to Mr. Chen didn't just help him, it created a ripple effect that's helping all of us find our way back. The afternoon brought another surprise. May, who had been traveling back and forth between her home and her father's new apartment, made an announcement during the daily community meeting. I've accepted a job at the local hospital, she said, beaming. We're moving back here permanently. Lynn will finish the school year here, and I'll be working with the hospital's new community health initiative. The news was met with cheers and hugs. Lynn could hardly contain her excitement as she hugged Lily. We're going to be neighbors, she squealed. And I can help with the youth program every day. Later that day, a film crew arrived from a national news network to document the community's transformation. They interviewed various people who had been impacted by the changes, but they were particularly interested in filming Lily and Mr. Chen at the park bench where their story began. Looking back, Lily said to the interviewer, I never thought sharing my lunch could lead to all this. I just saw someone who looked like they could use a friend. Mr. Chen added, what Lily taught all of us is that community isn't just about living in the same place, it's about seeing each other, hearing each other's stories, and being willing to help even when it's not easy or convenient. The reporter asked them to demonstrate their famous lunch-sharing moment, but something unexpected happened. As they sat on the bench, several people from the community appeared, each carrying food to share. The simple reenactment turned into an impromptu community picnic, with people from all walks of life sitting together, sharing food and stories. Among them was a young man who had been sleeping rough just 2 weeks ago. Through the library's program, he had found temporary housing and a job at the coffee shop. The most important thing, he told the camera crew, isn't just the practical help, though that's crucial. It's knowing that people care, that they see you as a person with a story worth hearing. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Lily's grandmother arrived with a fresh batch of her famous cookies, the same kind that had started it all. She had been teaching cooking classes at the community center, sharing not just recipes but the stories behind them, helping people connect through food and culture. Food has a way of bringing people together, she explained, watching people share her cookies. Just like stories. They both feed something deep inside us, our need for connection, for understanding, for belonging. The film crew captured these moments of natural community connection, but what they couldn't fully capture was the subtle way the community had changed. People made eye contact more often now, stopped to talk instead of hurrying past. The invisible walls between different social groups had begun to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding and compassion. As the day drew to a close, Lily, Lynn, and Mr. Chen sat together on their bench, sharing the last of the cookies. Around them, the park had become a symbol of community transformation, no longer just a place people passed through, but a place where connections were made, stories were shared, and hope was renewed. You know what I've learned? Lynn said thoughtfully, brushing cookie crumbs from her lap. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. Mr. Chen smiled, putting an arm around each girl. And sometimes, he added, the smallest choices reveal the biggest truths, that we're all connected, all worthy of kindness, all part of each other's stories. 2 months after the first lunch sharing, the impact of Lily and Mr. Chen's story had grown far beyond their small community. The national news coverage had sparked a movement, with communities across the country reaching out to learn how they could replicate their success. On this crisp morning, Mr. Chen stood in front of his computer screen, preparing for his first national webinar on community building. "Remember to breathe, Ye," Lin said, adjusting the microphone on his desk. She and Lily had become his unofficial technical support team, helping him navigate the digital aspects of sharing their story with a broader audience. The webinar room was filling up quickly, library directors, community leaders, and social workers from across the country eager to learn from their experience. But what made this session special was that it wasn't just Mr. Chen speaking. They had invited several community members whose lives had been transformed over the past 2 months to share their stories. Mrs. Rivera's food truck business had become a model for social enterprise. She joined the webinar from her newly expanded kitchen, where she was training other community members in culinary skills. "It's not just about feeding people," she explained to the audience. "It's about giving them their dignity back, one meal at a time." The former executive, now running the financial literacy program at the library, shared how losing everything had taught him the true meaning of wealth. "I used to measure success in dollars," he said. "Now I measure it in the number of people I can help get back on their feet." Lily sat beside Mr. Chen, ready to share her perspective as well. She had been invited to speak at several schools about youth involvement in community service, but this was her first time addressing a national audience. As she waited for her turn, she thought about how much had changed in such a short time. Their library's transformation had caught the attention of a major philanthropic foundation, which had chosen their program as a model for a national initiative. The foundation had pledged substantial funding to help other communities implement similar programs, with Mr. Chen and his team serving as consultants. "What makes this program different," the foundation's representative explained during the webinar, "is that it's not just about providing services. It's about changing how communities see and treat each other. It's about recognizing that everyone has value, everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be heard." The statistics they shared were impressive. In just 2 months, their program had helped 23 people find stable housing, 35 secure employment, and countless others access vital services. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The real transformation was in the way the community had come together. During the Q&A session, someone asked about the challenges they'd faced. Mr. Chen looked at Lily before answering. The biggest challenge was taking the first step. It's easy to walk past someone in need, to think it's someone else's problem to solve. But Lily showed us that sometimes the smallest gesture can break down the biggest barriers. As the webinar continued, they shared practical advice about setting up community programs, but they emphasized that the most important element couldn't be found in any manual or guidebook. It was the willingness to see everyone as worthy of dignity and respect. Meanwhile, in their community, the changes continued to multiply. The Story Wall had inspired an art project where local artists worked with community members to create a massive mural depicting their interconnected stories. The park bench where it all began had been officially designated as a community landmark, with a small plaque telling their story. The youth volunteer program that Lily and Lynn had started had grown to include over 50 students from 3 local schools. They organized regular community events, from shared meals to storytelling sessions, ensuring that the spirit of connection remained strong. "You know what's really amazing?" Lily said during a break in the webinar. "It's not just that we're helping people in need. It's that everyone is starting to understand that we all need each other. The people who came to get help are now the ones helping others." She was right. Many of the people who had initially come to the library seeking assistance were now volunteers themselves, using their experiences to help others navigate similar challenges. The community had created a sustainable cycle of support and understanding. After the webinar, Mr. Chen received emails from dozens of communities eager to start their own programs. But one message stood out. It was from his old library in China, where he had first discovered his love of books and helping others. They wanted to implement a similar program, creating an international bridge of compassion and understanding. That evening, as they celebrated the successful webinar with a community dinner in the park, Lily's grandmother made a special announcement. She had been working with local restaurants to create a community cookbook, featuring recipes and stories from people who had been part of their journey. Food brings people together, she said, but stories keep them together. Each recipe in this book comes with a story of hope, of struggle, of triumph. When we share our stories, we share pieces of ourselves. The cookbook project had already received pre-orders from across the country, with all proceeds going to support the community outreach program. But more importantly, it represented how far they had come, from a simple shared lunch to a community that had learned to share everything: food, stories, resources, and hope. As the sun set on another transformative day, Mr. Chen gathered everyone around the landmark bench for a photo. Looking at the diverse group of people who now called each other family, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 2 months ago, I sat on this bench feeling invisible and alone, he said. Today, I look around and see hundreds of visible connections, thousands of shared stories, and endless possibilities for more kindness to spread. And it all started because one young girl chose to see me, not as a homeless man, but as a person worthy of sharing lunch with. Lily, standing between Mr. Chen and Lin, felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. She had learned that change didn't require grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes, it just required the courage to take the first step, to share what you have, and to believe that every person's story matters. 6 months after that first shared lunch, Lily stood on a small stage in front of the newly expanded community center, her heart full of emotion. The center had grown from a single room in the library to occupy an entire renovated building, complete with a dining hall, classrooms, counseling offices, and a state-of-the-art computer lab. But more impressive than the physical changes were the transformations in people's lives. Today was a special celebration, the official opening of the Bridge of Hope Community Foundation, named after Mr. Chen's favorite metaphor about books being bridges between worlds. The foundation would ensure that their work could continue and expand, supporting similar initiatives across the country. When I shared my lunch that day, Lily began her speech, looking out at the gathered crowd. I wasn't thinking about changing the world. I just saw someone who looked like they could use a friend. But that's the thing about kindness, you never know how far its ripples will reach. In the front row, Mr. Chen sat with Mei and Lin, who had fully settled into their new life in the community. He was no longer just the program director at the library, he had become a nationally recognized advocate for community-based solutions to homelessness. His approach, combining practical support with dignity and human connection, had been adopted by cities across the country. But this isn't just my story, Lily continued, gesturing to the crowd. It's all of our stories woven together. She pointed to Mrs. Rivera, whose food truck program had expanded into a full-scale culinary training institute, helping dozens of people build new careers. To the former executive, whose financial literacy program had helped hundreds of families avoid or recover from financial crisis. To the local artists who had transformed the community with murals telling stories of hope and resilience. The statistics were impressive: over 200 people housed, 300 employed, and countless lives touched by the ripple effects of community support. But the real success stories weren't in the numbers, they were in the changed hearts and minds of the community. 6 months ago, we saw homelessness as someone else's problem, Lily said. Now we understand that community means nobody gets left behind. We've learned that everyone has value, everyone has potential, and everyone deserves a chance to rewrite their story. The Foundation's launch marked a new chapter in their journey. With support from national organizations and local businesses, they had created a sustainable model that could be replicated in other communities. The cookbook Lily's grandmother had initiated had become a national bestseller, with proceeds funding new programs and initiatives. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared refreshments, Lily found herself back at the famous bench with Mr. Chen and Lin. The bench had been preserved in its original location but was now the centerpiece of a beautiful garden where people could sit, share food, and tell their stories. "You know," Mr. Chen said, running his hand along the bench's weathered wood, "when I was at my lowest point, I thought my story was over. I thought I had nothing left to give. But you showed me that every story has the potential for a new chapter." Lin, who had grown into a confident young community leader herself, added, "And now we're helping other people write their new chapters too." The garden around them was filled with people whose lives had been touched by their program. There was the young mother who had gone from living in her car to running the center's childcare program. The veteran who now coordinated housing assistance for other veterans in need. The teenager who had been inspired to start a similar program in his school. Each person carried their own story of transformation, but they all shared a common thread, the understanding that community was about more than just living in the same place. It was about seeing each other, supporting each other, and believing in each other's potential for change. As the evening progressed, the community gathered for their now traditional storytelling session. But this time, instead of stories of hardship and hope, they shared their visions for the future. The foundation would fund educational scholarships, support small business initiatives, and continue expanding their network of community support. "Remember when I used to say that books were bridges?" Mr. Chen asked during the session. "Now I understand that stories themselves are bridges, bridges between past and future, between struggle and hope, between strangers who become family." The national news crews had returned to cover the Foundation's launch, but they found a very different story than the one they'd first reported. This wasn't just about a girl who shared her lunch or a homeless man who found his way home. It was about a community that had discovered its heart, its purpose, and its power to create lasting change. As the sun set on their celebration, casting a golden glow over the gathered community, Lily reflected on how much had changed. The simple act of sharing her lunch had sparked a movement, but it was the community's response, their willingness to open their hearts and join the effort, that had turned that spark into a lasting flame. "The best part," she told the reporters, "isn't what we've already accomplished. It's knowing that this is just the beginning. Every day, more communities are reaching out, more stories are being shared, more bridges are being built." The Foundation's first initiative would be a nationwide Share Your Story campaign, encouraging communities to create their own spaces for connection and support. Mr. Chen would travel to help set up programs, while Lily and Lin would continue their youth outreach work, showing other young people that they were never too young to make a difference. As the evening drew to a close, someone started singing, and others joined in. The sound of voices raised together floated out over the community garden, a symbol of how individual stories had merged into one powerful chorus of hope and change. "You know what I've learned?" Lily said to Mr. Chen and Lin as they sat together on their bench one last time that evening. "It's that the end of one story is just the beginning of another. And as long as we keep sharing, keep caring, keep believing in each other, there's no limit to the stories we can create together." Mr. Chen smiled, looking out at the community they had built together. "And to think," he said softly, "it all started with a simple question: would you like to share my lunch?" The stars began to appear overhead, twinkling like distant promises of hope. In the garden, people lingered, reluctant to let the magical evening end. But they all knew that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to share, to help, to build bridges between hearts and lives. For in the end, their story wasn't just about helping people find homes or jobs or hope. It was about rediscovering the true meaning of community, one lunch, one story, one act of kindness at a time. The end.